Hey, now that we've learned a little bit about Africa's past, it's time to consider Africa in the modern era. What are some of the things that come to mind when you think of modern Africa? Unfortunately, most of us think of Africa as being a continent in crisis. Perhaps we see it as being riddled with war and corruption. We see it imploding from disease, starvation, poverty, things like that. Who's to blame for this? And unfortunately, uh, many times African people are blamed for their plight. Many people see Africa as a place where people are intolerant of ethnic and religious differences. Some would go so far as to say that Africa may be a place where people are either unwilling or unable to govern themselves. And I would argue that these are rather simplistic misconceptions. Um, they're not only inaccurate, but they are also kind of dangerous because they imply that these complex causes um, are due to things that happened in the past, and that they kind of diminish the chance that these problems can be solved in the future. So, um, now, if we look at the historical roots of violence, poverty, corruption in Africa, it becomes clear that the current predicament that Africa finds itself in is not solely the result of Africa's decisions. Um, Oftentimes, they are the consequences of foreign intrusion into African affairs. Many of today's challenges that Africa faces are the outcome of colonial, political, and economic practices, Cold War alliances, and attempts by outsiders to influence African political and economic systems during the decolonization and the post independent periods. Um, Although a lot of local issues have sparked numerous recent disputes, external political and military interventions have altered their dynamics and rendered them even all that much more lethal, I would say. For instance, let's take into consideration the Cold War. This was a time after World War II from about the mid 1940s to 1991 when the United States and the Soviet Union, Russia, experienced a great deal of political competition. There was economic rivalry and there was military friction as well. During this time period, all U.S. presidents, whether they're Republican or Democrat, opposed any and all political movements that the U.S. could not control. And it was also during this time that African nations were gaining independence from European powers. So it should come as no surprise to you that the U.S. had hoped to replace um, European imperial powers as the dominant external force in Africa. The alternative would be an African continent that was succumbed to like radical nationalism and communism. The fear of communism, real or imagined, um, would show up differently across Africa. So when I bring up the Peace Corps, this image kind of came up prematurely. Um, when I bring up the Peace Corps, your mind probably doesn't jump automatically to the Cold War. Um, President Kennedy established the Peace Corps with an executive order in 1961. The hope was that young American men and women would spend their time volunteering in these so called third world countries in order to foster world peace and cooperation. And you need to know that the moniker third world, it's something that we don't often use that often anymore, but you'll hear it. This I heard it a lot as a kid, but this label third world country was just a term that was applied to countries that were susceptible to communist influence due to their degree of development or their lack of development. And so basically, what the United States wanted to do is they wanted to make sure that these countries, these newly independent countries in Africa, did not become communist nations and they didn't want them to fall under the Soviet sphere of influence. So you could argue, and I would argue, that the Peace Corps is a great program, even if its covert objective was to keep countries from becoming communist nations. If you take a look at the history of the Peace Corps, more than 230,000 people have volunteered through the Peace Corps, and right now there are currently about 7,000 people that are serving. Most of them are really young. About 7% of them throughout the history of the Peace Corps have been over age 50, but mostly we think of the students and young adults, most likely your age, college age, things like that. 46% of that 230,000 people have volunteered in Africa. And they've done things like worked in the areas of public health, education, the environment, agriculture, economic development, and that's just to name a few. Okay, so that has been a good thing that's happened because of the Cold War. But on the other hand, our administrations in Washington, D.C. have also supported a lot of unsavory dictators, in Zaire and Somalia and apartheid South Africa, all in the name of stopping communism from taking hold in Africa. And I should point out that many of these dictatorships have been guilty of hijacking democratic elections and committing crimes against humanity. And depending on who you sided with, if you were an African leader during the Cold War, you were probably receiving financial support and military weapons from either the United States or the Soviet Union. And many times, if you were a not so good dude, the United States was looking the other way because, hey, at least you weren't a communist or a socialist nation. Interesting. So the end of the Cold War, it did have an impact on Africa. And if you think about it, there were a lot of African dictators that were no longer needed to stop the spread of communism because communism ended with the implosion of the Soviet Union. And so you have these people that were left to their own devices. And they were cut out by the United States. And so they're left looking over a legacy of looted resources, massive debt that they owe Western financial institutions, dysfunctional states, and multiple regional wars. Civil wars erupted all over the place. Liberia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and that's just to name a few. Genocide is something we will look at and discuss this week. Kleptocracy. This is a form of political and government corruption where the government exists to increase the personal wealth of those in power. So you have the personal wealth and political power of its officials and the ruling class at the expense of the wider population. All right, rule by thieves, kleptocracy. Does that mean that we stayed out of Africa's affairs? Not necessarily. Since the Cold War ended, there have been new justifications for foreign intervention in Africa that have emerged. The Cold War paradigm of stopping So the spread of communism has been replaced by one of that we have a responsibility to protect people, and also we have a war on terror to deal with. So some foreign governments and multilateral organizations have interceded in conflicts to protect civilian lives, the responsibility to protect, and to restore regional stability. However, these outside powers, the United States included, have tended to engage uh, selectively, choosing conflict zones that advance their own political, economic, and strategic interests while ignoring other ones. Um, Everything is politicized. International humanitarian and peacekeeping efforts have been marred by conflicting interests that have sometimes ended up hurting the people that they intended to assist. The Cold War, the War on Terror, like its Cold War antecedent, has increased American and European military presence on the continent of Africa, and it has generated new external support for repressive governments, and it has oftentimes contributed to an escalation of violence in many African regions. So rather than promoting security, outside intervention has often intensified strife and undermined prospects for peace, demonstrating to us yet once again how failure to learn from the past has obscured the pitfalls of the future. So this week, I want you to look at the module and think about what you would like to focus on as a project to look at contemporary issues on the continent of Africa. Have a great week. Take time every day to work on your AEO classes. Email me if you have any questions. I hope to hear from you soon. Welcome to the new semester, and I'll talk to you very soon. Take care.